She was gone for 22 days and came back branded, starved, chained. But none of it was real. So why did she do it? It started with the blood. A crimson streak, half dried, dragged across the frost-bitten grass off the side of Sunrise Drive. The wire from a pair of white earbuds tangled in the weeds nearby, one of them soaked in something dark. A clump of blonde hair still attached to the foamed tip. No body, no scream, just that strange metallic smell, the kind that only ever comes from something freshly torn. The phone lay face down a few feet away, screen cracked. The lock screen still glowing dimly in the morning haze. 10:47 a.m. That would later become a timestamp, a reference point. But in that moment it was just eerie, like the clock had stopped at the exact moment someone vanished. No tire marks, no sign of a chase, just silence. The kind that doesn't comfort, it unsettles. The kind that presses in behind your ears and makes the back of your neck tighten. Something had happened here, something intimate and terrifying. And whoever was responsible had made sure there'd be just enough left behind to be found. This wasn't the scene of a random abduction. That became evident early on, though no one dared say it. Not then. Not when all anyone could think was, where is she? Sherri Papini, 34, wife, mother of 2, blonde, smiling in every photo, the kind of smile that suggested stability, church-going, PTA, jogged the same route every morning, always back by lunch. On the outside, her life fit into every mold we associate with safety. Family, routine, small-town predictability. But scenes like this don't erupt from nowhere. They grow, quietly, over time, and when they finally surface, they do so with surgical precision. The signs were subtle, almost invisible. Sherri's social media presence was minimal but curated. Clean, controlled. She wasn't outspoken, rarely posted personal thoughts. But behind closed doors there were reports. Whispers, really, about tension. Her marriage wasn't as seamless as it seemed. Friends spoke of emotional volatility, occasional disappearances in her younger years. Nothing criminal, nothing official, just absences, gaps. Behavior like this doesn't scream for attention. It manipulates it. That's the distinction most people miss when they try to understand cases like hers. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about desperation. It was about narrative, construction, a need to shape the world's gaze in a way that made her the center of it, helpless, hunted, heroic. That's what makes this kind of offender so uniquely chilling. Not the violence of the act. There was no physical violence at the scene, but the calculation behind it. The self-inflicted damage disguised as victimhood, the willingness to self-harm, to deceive family, law enforcement, an entire nation, just to maintain control over perception. In profiling terms, this falls somewhere between factitious disorder imposed on self, commonly known as Munchausen syndrome, and elements of narcissistic pathology, a compulsion to invent suffering, not for sympathy alone, but for power. Because to suffer publicly is to wield emotional influence, to command loyalty, to become untouchable. At first, no one wanted to think that. Not the officers at the scene, not her husband, certainly not the town of Reading. They clung to the possibility that she had been taken, that someone, some shadowy predator, had ripped her from her life without warning. The crime scene, sparse as it was, supported that theory just enough. But that streak of blood, it was too clean, too centered, not smeared in panic, not scattered from a struggle, just one deliberate mark, like a calling card, or a line drawn between the truth and a lie. It didn't take long for the search to begin. By late afternoon, Her husband, Keith Papini, had already sounded the alarm. He came home from work expecting to find the house full, the kind of messy, noisy chaos that comes with small children. But the place was still. Her car was in the driveway. The door was locked. Inside, everything looked untouched, except the silence. That deep, uneasy quiet that seeps in when something's gone very wrong. At first, he thought maybe she'd taken the kids out. But then came the unanswered texts, the unreturned calls, a creeping panic. He checked the daycare. The children were still there, forgotten. He used the Find My iPhone app. The ping came from a rural intersection not far from their home, Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail. He drove there, fast, frantic. And what he found was what the deputies would later photograph. Her phone on the ground, earbuds tangled, strands of hair caught in the cord. No purse, no keys, no footprints leading anywhere. He called 911. His voice shook. He tried to sound clear, calm, but it broke repeatedly. Because he knew, he felt it in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't right. Something had taken her. Or someone. That night, as the search began, the story started to spread. A young mother, fit and pretty, vanishing without a trace during her morning jog. The media caught it fast. It had all the elements that catch attention. A beautiful woman, a quiet town, a family shattered. It was viral before the first posters were even printed. But behind the scenes, investigators began working with methodical restraint. They had no signs of forced entry, no eyewitnesses, no ransom call. The items at the scene told a strange story. The phone had been placed carefully. The strands of hair weren't torn at the root. There was no drag mark, no blood trail beyond that single line. And Keith became their first focus. As is always the case, spouses are scrutinized early. Statistically, it's reasonable. Emotionally, it's unbearable. Keith cooperated. He cried. He volunteered for polygraphs. He walked them through their last conversation, their daily routine, even the arguments they'd had in the past. There were some, like any couple. He admitted that. Sometimes she was moody, volatile. She didn't like being questioned. She wanted things her way. But he never spoke of violence, not once. Still, they probed, interviewed neighbors, pulled texts, dug through phone records, and nothing led anywhere. As the days passed, the community responded. Volunteers combed the woods. Drones searched ravines. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles, pinned to corkboards at gas stations. Prayer vigils were held on street corners, candlelight flickering against winter breath. People clung to the belief that she was out there, alive, waiting to be found. 22 days passed, and then she returned. Early Thanksgiving morning, a driver spotted her on the shoulder of Interstate 5 near Woodland, over 100 miles from where she vanished. She was thin, dirty, bruised. Her wrists were bound with zip ties, a chain around her waist. A hose clamp locked it in place. Her hair was cut unevenly, her face swollen, a symbol burned into her shoulder. It was grotesque. It was horrifying. It was everything the public had feared. She told them 2 women had taken her, Hispanic, masked, armed. She'd been kept in a small room, starved, shamed, threatened with being sold. She said she didn't know why, said she'd tried to escape but couldn't, until finally they let her go. No explanation, no warning. Just opened the door and pushed her out onto the road. Her husband, when he saw her again, collapsed. She was held overnight at the hospital. Her injuries were photographed. They were real. Cuts, bruises, a broken nose. The brand, the chain. The public breathed a sigh of relief. She was safe. Home. It was over. But it wasn't, because something in her story didn't sit right. And in the silence that followed her return, as detectives began to sort fact from fiction, they found themselves pulled into something stranger than they could have imagined. The details were off. Timelines shifted, descriptions blurred, and she was difficult, not just traumatized, resistant. The case wasn't closed. It had only just begun. She wouldn't look them in the eyes. When detectives sat across from her in the living room she had just returned to, surrounded by family photos and half-deflated balloons that read, "Welcome home," Sherri Papini wrapped her arms tightly around her knees. She sat that way for hours, childlike, her body folded in, as if bracing against the air itself. She answered questions, slowly, sometimes through tears, other times in a whisper so thin it nearly vanished before reaching the recorder. They asked her to walk them through it. From the very beginning, from the moment she stepped off the porch for that run. She said it was just a normal day. She'd fed the chickens, dropped the kids at daycare, texted Keith to come home for lunch. She even laughed once, recounting how he hadn't responded, and she'd sent a second message, "Come home to me." That text had become a timestamp, too. But then her tone changed. She described a vehicle, a woman in the passenger seat, the car backed up, a gun, a command. She crouched down, afraid, set her phone on the ground. Then, darkness. The room they kept her in, she said, had no windows, just a closet, a mattress on the floor, a chain around her waist, locked to a pole. Her wrists were zip-tied behind her back most of the time. She couldn't bathe. Her skin had developed a rash. She was fed scraps, sometimes spoiled. The older woman hit her, branded her, cut her hair. The younger one tried to be kind, brought her apples, spoke softly, but never removed the restraints. They asked what the women looked like. She couldn't say. They wore masks, spoke in Spanish, always from behind. Detectives noted the vagueness, the repetition, the lack of sensory detail where it should have been strongest. Trauma can do that, fracture memory, scramble time. But even so, there was something else, a rehearsed rhythm in her speech, a pattern. It wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't. She never once asked if they'd found the women. She never once mentioned fear for others, only herself. And she didn't want to be examined. The inconsistencies were small at first, just enough to create discomfort. Then came the physical evidence. The brand, for instance, was too straight, too clean, not the erratic mark of a struggling victim. It had been done with care, precision, as if placed, not forced. And the zip ties, no signs of skin abrasion consistent with long-term wear. The bruising, some of it days old, some fresh, as though timed. She had been missing for 22 days, but it was unclear how many of those days she had actually been restrained. Keith remained at her side through every interview. At first, he watched her with quiet awe, sat close, rubbed her back when she faltered. But over time, something in him began to shift, subtle, like a tide going out. His eyes lingered too long when she struggled to remember. He asked questions of his own. His hand no longer reached for hers, because the truth, when it started to take shape, wasn't a clean line. It was a slow unraveling. The DNA on her clothing didn't belong to a woman. It belonged to a man named James Reyes, an old boyfriend, someone she hadn't seen in over a decade. Supposedly. The match came from a database, familial tracing. Once they had his name, they followed the threads, and what they found undid everything. James told them the truth. Reluctantly, shamefully, but clearly. She had contacted him months before the disappearance. They'd spoken often. She told him she was being abused, said she needed to escape, that she couldn't go to the police because Keith had too many friends in law enforcement. She needed a place to hide, somewhere safe, quiet. So he drove up from Southern California, picked her up near the intersection of Sunrise and Old Oregon Trail, just like she said, but not under threat, not at gunpoint. She got into the back seat willingly, no struggle, no scream, and for 3 weeks she lived with him. She stayed inside, rarely left the room, didn't contact her children. He brought her groceries, let her use his phone. He said she seemed peaceful, not scared, not broken. And then, when she said it was time, he helped her prepare. He bought a branding tool. At her request, he shot hockey pucks at her legs to leave bruises. At her insistence, he helped cut her hair. And then he drove her back north, dropped her by the side of the freeway before sunrise. She got out, chained herself, and waited for someone to see. James kept the receipts, the texts, the burner phone. He passed a polygraph. She didn't. When they confronted her, Sherri folded inward again, just like before. Pulled her knees in, covered her face, said she didn't want anyone to get in trouble. But it was already too late. The damage was done. To the community, to her family, to every person who had searched for her, prayed for her, believed in her. She had turned their fear into theater. And now the curtain was falling. It's strange, the way silence settles after the lie collapses. There wasn't outrage at first. No dramatic confrontation, no gasps of betrayal, just this weight, heavy and unmovable, like the breath had been taken out of the room, and no one quite knew how to fill it again. Keith sat across from the agents, his hands motionless, his eyes vacant. For 4 years, he had stood by her, defended her, slept beside her, loved her, and now all of it, every moment, every word, had been reshaped into something else, something he hadn't recognized. When they told her the DNA was James's, she didn't deny it. Not really. She tried to explain it away, said it couldn't be, said he must have lied. But her voice cracked. Not in protest, in fear. She wasn't fighting for the truth. She was trying to delay the consequences. But the truth had already taken root. In the eyes of the investigators, it was clear. They had reconstructed the timeline, the burner phone, the care package she mailed herself, the receipts for the branding tool for the prepaid phones, surveillance footage of her walking alone in a town hours from where she claimed she'd been held. Everything she said had happened, hadn't, and everything she said she didn't do, she had. This wasn't impulse. It was architecture, carefully planned, meticulously executed, and cloaked in the iconography of trauma. It was a performance, but it wasn't careless, which is what makes it all the more unsettling. In forensic psychology, we look at behavior like this through a very narrow lens. Not just what someone did, but why. What belief, what need drove them to orchestrate pain, wear it like a costume, and offer it to the world with trembling hands? In Sherri's case, it wasn't money, not at first. And it wasn't escape either, not from a real threat. It was about control, emotional leverage, the ability to vanish and return transformed, to be mourned and then worshipped, untouched by the mundane. The injuries were real. That's the part that disturbs people most. She broke her own nose, starved herself, branded her own skin. There's something primal about that, something almost religious, as if she believed pain could redeem her, or, at the very least, protect her. But from what? Perhaps from the ordinariness of life, from the unraveling threads of a marriage, from fading youth, from the suffocating predictability of motherhood, or maybe, more simply, from herself. By faking her own kidnapping, Sherri created a version of herself that the world would never doubt. A victim, a survivor, someone worth saving. And she succeeded, for a while. The public believed her. The media covered her return like a miracle. Victim funds were granted. Over $300,000 in assistance, therapy, disability. She even coached her children on what to say, how to help protect Mommy. The delusion wasn't isolated. It became shared, until it fractured. In March 2022, after years of quiet surveillance, the FBI made their move. She was at her children's piano lesson. A man entered the lobby and told her someone had hit her car. When she stepped outside, she was surrounded. She screamed, threw her phone, tried to run, but it was over in seconds. They handcuffed her in front of the school, and the image was the last puzzle piece. Not the bruised, chained woman limping down a freeway, not the broken voice behind a hospital curtain, but this: arms wrenched behind her back, mascara streaking down her cheeks, lips parted in disbelief. The performance was over, and when she pled guilty, mail fraud, false statements, the illusion ended, too. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, ordered to pay restitution. But the real damage couldn't be measured in numbers, because trust isn't something you can repay. And in the end, what Sherri Papini stole wasn't just time or money or resources. It was belief. She took the face of every real victim and wore it like a mask. And when the mask fell, it wasn't horror underneath. It was something quieter, sadder. A woman who wanted to disappear so badly. She forgot who she'd have to become to make it happen. There's something quiet about the aftermath of deceit. It doesn't explode. It seeps, slowly, like water into wood, darkening everything it touches. After her sentencing, Sherri Papini was taken into federal custody. No cameras followed her this time. No headlines printed hopeful updates. The same community that once searched tirelessly through woods and creek beds for her now turned away with something close to shame or exhaustion. People stopped talking about her in grocery stores. They stopped wondering if she was safe, because now they knew. Inside prison walls, she served her time, not long by comparison, but long enough for the illusion to lose its shine. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a fraud, a mother, a wife, a woman who broke herself in order to be rescued. And for those of us who study this, who've seen stories like hers, though rarely as public, we recognize something deeper in her choices. Self-inflicted victimhood is rare, but not impossible. The patterns are distinct. It often begins with a fracture in identity, a longing to be seen, to be held in the kind of light that suffering brings. There's a strange comfort in being pitied, in being the center of concern. Sherri didn't disappear to hide. She vanished to be found. She planned it in silence, built it one text, one lie, one matchstick at a time. And the pain? That wasn't a side effect. It was part of the design, the bruises, the branding, the chain. It was as though she believed her suffering had to be earned, to be believed. She enlisted James because he was familiar, harmless, someone she could control, and perhaps he believed in some fractured way that he was helping her, that she really needed to get away. She told him about abuse, about fear, words that carry weight. He didn't question them, and when the plan unfolded, he went along, quietly, obediently. He was her mirror, not her captor. But real trauma has a way of leaving behind echoes, and this was hollow. When the FBI finally spoke to James, he broke quickly, not because he was guilty in the way people assume, but because the burden had become too heavy. He described every moment, how he drove to get her, how she stayed in his bedroom, how she paced, cleaned, cooked, asked for help with the brand, how she cried, how she slept. He said she missed her children. That's the part he repeated the most. And maybe that's what cracked it open for Keith, not the DNA, not the polygraphs, but the realization that for 22 days she didn't call, didn't write, didn't ask if the kids were okay. She'd vanished before, when she was younger. She had a history of leaving when things got hard. There were reports, childhood friends, old boyfriends, stories that didn't make sense then, but echo now with a darker tone. Running was familiar. Reinvention was survival. But pretending to be stolen, that crossed into something else. Keith filed for divorce 2 days after her guilty plea. He asked for full custody of their children. In his statement, he said he was still struggling to understand how someone he trusted with his life, someone he built a family with, could orchestrate such harm. He spoke plainly, not with anger, just weariness, and I believe him. Because in the end, Sherri didn't just hurt herself. She created a wound that bled into everyone around her. Her children, her husband, her parents, the entire community. She rewrote their reality with lies that felt like truth because they were soaked in pain. Real victims watched her story unfold with quiet horror, not just because it mocked their suffering, but because, for a moment, they had believed her too. That is the most dangerous part of deception. It doesn't just steal trust. It poisons belief. And when belief dies, what's left behind is silence. Heavy, still, like a scream that never made it past the lips.